A bronze bow shield marked with the SPQR motto, in some views only the final QR letter standing clear of the sand, rests on the trench floor. For decades, the battleship's exact resting place remained uncertain, its key identifying features hidden in deep water. The sudden destruction of the flagship represented an irreversible step in naval combat, driven by an entirely new mechanism of warfare. On September 9, 1943, an incoming strike from German Dornier bombers utilized an advanced class of guided weapon, recognized as the Fritz X glide bomb. The weapon found the massive warship with lethal precision. The resulting devastation shattered the heavily armored behemoth, killing Admiral Carlo Bergamini and roughly 1,350 to 1,393 men, and depending on how the loss figures are reported, the Roma did not sink onto a flat, accessible abyssal plain. As the armored structures tore apart at the surface, enormous masses of steel plunged into the steep, broken seabed of the Gulf of Asinara. In that rugged terrain, ravines, rocky ribs, and abrupt drops, large fragments could settle in pockets, where conventional sonar returns become cluttered, ambiguous, and hard to separate from the surrounding rock. This severe topography generated an absolute regime of environmental denial. The extreme depth and the sharp angles of the ravines made standard wide-area search methods practically useless. Traditional towed acoustic arrays sweeping over the Gulf of Asinara would simply bounce signals off the massive geological ridges. The returns yielded only chaotic noise, completely masking the clear metallic signatures of a sunken battleship. The shattered pieces of the flagship were entirely camouflaged by the sheer scale of the underwater canyon. Because of this harsh geological reality, the resting place of the Roma remained unconfirmed until June 17, 2012, nearly 7 decades after the sinking. The loss of the fleet commander and well over 1,000 sailors ensured that any eventual discovery would carry immense moral and jurisdictional weight. Italy treats the site as a military shrine and a war grave. Access, research, and any potential intervention fall under Italian authority, and any recovery would require explicit state consent. In practice, that meant a strict non-contact approach, documenting and not disturbing, even as the canyon environment resisted basic remote detection. For over 6 decades, the primary physical evidence of the guided bomb attack lay entombed in the cold dark. The sheer cliffs of the underwater canyon successfully shielded the primary hull mass, the detached weapon systems, and the highly diagnostic bronze bow shield from any passing surface ships or conventional survey equipment. The environmental barrier was so robust that it easily outlasted generations of naval search technology. The ocean had effectively sealed the definitive forensic proof of the attack away from human eyes, protecting the scattered debris field through pure geographical force. The ultimate operational puzzle was not simply a matter of dragging a sensor back and forth across a grid. It was a problem of geometric access, at our remote sensor limits, and extreme physical restraint. Surveying this specific site required safely penetrating a deep, rocky ravine that had already defeated multiple wide-area military sweeps. The operation demanded a method capable of plunging straight down into a jagged, blind canyon to retrieve indisputable visual proof, such as the bronze fleet shield, without ever making physical contact with the hull. The fundamental question stood unanswered. Marine engineers had to figure out how to positively identify a shattered flagship, swallowed by a sheer underwater canyon without dragging heavy tethers that would inevitably snag on the rocks or desecrate an untouched war grave. The deep and heavily scarred canyon terrain of the Gulf of Asinara created a perfect geometric trap for standard acoustic searches. Military towed sonar systems operate by casting sound waves across a wide, relatively flat area to catch the hard return of a continuous metallic hull. However, the sheer walls, plunging ravines, and overlapping ridges of this specific seabed fractured those acoustic signals. The sound waves bounced off the vertical rock faces, scattering into chaotic noise and false echoes. The aggressive bottom topography actively masked any large anomalies resting in the trenches. This extreme terrain meant that even sophisticated wide-area sweeps could return confusing echoes and ambiguous anomalies without delivering the kind of clean, unmistakable signature needed for positive identification. In the Gulf of Asinara, geology did not make detection impossible. it made certainty painfully hard to earn. The shattered condition of the hull further degraded any coherent sonar profile, actively aiding the geological camouflage. This extreme fragmentation was the direct result of the Fritz X glide bomb. This system was an early precision-guided gravity weapon steered via a radio link by a bombardier who observed a tracking flare on the tail of the bomb. This steering mechanism allowed the aircraft to execute high-altitude, armor-piercing strikes from above the most effective band of shipboard anti-aircraft fire. The bombardier could make continuous flight path corrections as the heavy munition accelerated toward the target. The initial strike delivered by this guided system tore into the starboard side with immense kinetic force. Contemporary accounts describe catastrophic flooding and a rapid loss of propulsion as vital machinery spaces were compromised, with secondary fires and power failures spreading through the ship as damage cascaded aft. While the first hit was devastating, the ultimate structural annihilation of the warship was driven by a second guided weapon. Weighing about 3,450 pounds as a complete bomb, it carried a far smaller explosive charge within that total mass. It struck the forward section with terrible effect near the main battery and the ship's armored core. Plunging into the ship's interior, the explosion is widely associated with the ammunition spaces linked to main turret number 2, setting off an immediate and uncontrollable chain reaction inside the armored citadel. The resulting destruction was not a simple high-explosive blast alone, but a catastrophic magazine event, a violent deflagration of stored propellant charges that generated overwhelming heat and expanding gases inside the armored spaces. Instead of a single sharp shock, the ship suffered an eruptive internal rupture. Steel was forced outward, compartments failed in sequence, and the forward section began to disintegrate before the hull could ever sink as one intact silhouette. Because of this immense outward pressure, the structural continuity of the vessel was instantly destroyed. The warship did not glide to the bottom as a single, easily identifiable acoustic target. Instead, heavy armor, deck plating, and internal machinery were violently ejected and dispersed across the water column. When these shattered pieces finally slammed into the plunging canyons below, they tumbled into isolated ravines and settled at extreme angles. The irregular shapes of the torn steel blended perfectly with the jagged rock formations of the trench. Standard military sonar requires a distinct, continuous shape to reliably classify a man-made target, but the deflagration had erased the familiar profile of a battleship. The combination of complete structural disassembly and highly hostile geology rendered conventional acoustic hunting completely blind. Locating a massive warship shattered into pieces within a jagged acoustic shadow required a completely non-traditional robotic approach. Standard military sonar could struggle to resolve chaotic echoes returning from deep ravines, in setting a hard, practical limit for traditional search vessels in this terrain. To find the lost flagship, the search methodology required a reversal of scale. Instead of a massive surface ship dragging thick steel cables, Italian engineer Guido Gay used a highly localized, minimal footprint approach. Operating from an about 21-meter, roughly 69-foot, catamaran named Daedalus, he could hold station quietly and work with lighter gear better suited to canyon edges. The key to this precise search was a specialized piece of hardware. Gay designed and piloted an optical survey robot named Pluto Pala, a small battery-powered observation vehicle built for deep, complex canyons. Instead of a heavy work-class umbilical, it used a thin, slightly buoyant fiber optic umbilical, about 3.5 millimeter in diameter, managed from the surface by a controlled winch, carrying video, data, and commands without the drag and snag risk of thicker cables. The vehicle's mission profile emphasized non-contact documentation, lighting, propulsion, and cameras first, not lifting, cutting, or intrusive tooling. Deploying this precise tool required immense patience and operational discipline. The target zone was located approximately 15 miles off the rugged coast of Sardinia. Navigating the surface currents, the crew guided the small catamaran while the vehicle descended deep into the hostile geology. The operating depth reached a punishing 3,900 feet. At this extreme depth, the ambient pressure is merciless, and the total darkness requires the robot to rely entirely on its own high-intensity lighting. The tiny vehicle carefully maneuvered through the plunging trenches, searching the seabed for any surviving fragments left behind by the massive propellant burst that had destroyed the battleship. Years of methodical searching finally culminated on June 17, 2012. Gliding just above the seabed, the cameras revealed a telltale battery of 90/50 mm anti-aircraft guns, a configuration strong enough to make the team say, at last, that Roma had been found. In subsequent passes, the survey documented additional unmistakable details, yet including the bronze bow shield marked with the SPQR motto, in some views the final QR letters standing out, and other scattered fittings that matched the battleship's known layout. Together, those images delivered the first credible, non-contact visual confirmation of identity, nearly 7 decades after the sinking. This visual identification was achieved under the strictest possible operational constraints. Because the site held the remains of hundreds of sailors, the Italian Navy enforced an absolute regime of jurisdictional denial over the wreckage. The search team operated under a rigid, non-disturbance boundary. They were completely forbidden from touching, retrieving, or altering a single piece of the scattered ship. The success of the mission relied entirely on disciplined restraint. The advanced optical sensors allowed the engineers to prove the identity and document the condition of the legendary vessel without ever physically intruding on the site. The single operator method proved that an agile, micro-tether approach could defeat the aggressive canyon geology that had shielded the wreckage for nearly 7 decades. By respecting the permanent boundary and relying solely on high-resolution cameras, the team achieved their primary survey objective without compromising the sanctity of the military war grave. The optical feed returned the first indisputable proof of identity, but mapping the massive primary hull within the trench presented a secondary spatial hazard. Tens of thousands of tons of heavily armored steel now rest entirely upside down on the silent canyon floor. The primary hull of the battleship did not survive the final plunge intact. As the immense internal pressure from the forward explosion breached the armored citadel, the sheer structural integrity of the flagship failed catastrophically. The hull violently broke in 2 massive, separate pieces before ever slipping beneath the surface of the sea. This catastrophic midship failure meant that the heaviest remaining sections of the vessel descended through the deep water column entirely independently, subject to extreme and chaotic hydrodynamic forces. Navigating the optical survey robot through the deepest ravines revealed the final resting orientation of one of the largest surviving hull sections. Rather than settling neatly on an even keel, this massive fragment appears overturned, with lower hull features visible where a viewer would expect the deck. The imagery suggests that the breakup and descent produced chaotic rotations and that heavy structures became partly buried in sediment on impact, leaving major areas of superstructure obscured, crushed, or hidden beneath the mass of the hull. However, this specific inverted geometry created an absolute and permanent proof ceiling for the forensic investigation. Because the enormous hull is perfectly upside down and driven deeply into the canyon floor, the critical lower engineering spaces are completely sealed off from any non-intrusive visual inspection. The very first guided bomb strike had detonated directly beneath the keel, flooding the vital boiler and engine rooms and crippling the speed of the flagship. Marine historians and engineers desperately needed to document the exact entry wound and the internal buckling caused by that initial kinetic impact. The upside-down orientation permanently protects that specific forensic evidence. The thickest armored belts and the heavy double-bottom plating now face the open water column, creating a massive, impenetrable steel vault over the crippled engineering compartments. The actual blast damage from the first strike lies buried either deep within the crushed superstructure underneath, or is hidden behind hundreds of feet of inaccessible, heavily fortified steel bulkheads. Because the jurisdictional boundary strictly forbids cutting metal, removing hull plating, or forcing entry into sealed internal compartments, no camera can ever reach the inner boiler rooms. The external imagery successfully established the exact resting state of the primary hull, but it remains physically insufficient to prove the exact internal path of the first weapon. The exact resting positions of the lower engineering spaces remain permanently inaccessible beneath the massive, inverted main hull sections. While the inverted structure permanently locked away the lower engineering spaces, the violent ejection forces had scattered diagnostic clues far beyond the primary trench. A stark physical contrast defined the outer edges of the wreckage. Several heavy anti-aircraft mounts were found detached and sitting upright in the deep sand, at odds with the overturned, broken resting state of the largest hull sections. Rather than proving a single neat narrative on their own, these scattered weapons suggest that powerful forces threw equipment clear of the ship before the main masses settled into the canyon. This scattered geometry provided the ultimate forensic proof of the destruction sequence. The extreme internal pressure from the massive propellant burst had violently expanded outward, blowing these secondary structures completely off the main deck long before the hull ever began to capsize. The deflagration ejected the anti-aircraft mounts high into the air as independent projectiles. Because of their heavy lower machinery, they acted like massive darts, rapidly stabilizing as they plunged through thousands of feet of water, finally landing perfectly upright on the flat sand. This same explosive geometry may also explain the location of one of the heaviest detached components in the debris field, a main battery turret found overturned and separated from the largest hull masses. Its displacement and isolation point to a violent breakup above the surface. But the exact path and timing of that ejection can only be inferred from the wider scatter pattern. To interpret the wider damage pattern, later surveys expanded the map with autonomous and tethered robots, a UVS for broad coverage, and smaller observation vehicles for close inspection. That wider sweep traced additional detached structures at the periphery and documented elements associated with the ship's aviation gear, including parts linked to the catapult system and the RO-43 reconnaissance aircraft, without claiming a complete airframe lay intact. The broader picture sharpened the scatter geometry while keeping the work strictly non-intrusive. By strictly mapping this detached evidence without touching a single piece of steel, marine investigators successfully pieced together the exact breakup sequence. The isolated main gun turret, the upright defensive mounts, and the distant seaplane all mathematically traced back to the catastrophic epicenter of the forward explosion. The scatter geometry perfectly mapped the final seconds of the warship above the surface. However, this widely scattered debris field also defined a permanent limit to the forensic investigation. While the outer ejection pattern proved the sheer, apocalyptic scale of the blast, the exact internal state of the forward magazines cannot ever be physically inspected. The direct epicenter of the destruction was entirely pulverized by the initial detonation, the massive internal fires, and the crushing deep water pressure. Even if specialized marine investigators were somehow permitted to penetrate the twisted, forward steel fragments which the strict non-disturbance mandate absolutely forbids, the physical evidence of the precise initial ignition sequence simply no longer exists. The sheer violence of the blast completely erased its own exact point of origin. The external mapping of the separated structures achieved the absolute maximum level of forensic certainty possible without intrusive physical salvage. The scattered geometry confirmed the catastrophic mid-air severing, leaving only the question of how to permanently govern a site that must never be touched. The sheer scale of the forensic discovery triggered a familiar tension: the hunger for historical knowledge versus the duty to protect a site that is also a grave. In legal practice, sunken state warships are commonly treated under the doctrine of sovereign immunity, meaning they remain subject to the flag state's control, and interference typically requires that states consent. Italy has publicly framed the Roma wreck as a protected military shrine and war grave, and the operational standard has been clear: observe, document, and do not disturb. That does not create a magical, automatic international contract that answers every scenario. Enforcement and jurisdiction depend on where the wreck lies and what authorities decide, but it does set a firm boundary for responsible exploration. The legacy of the operation is that boundary made real, high-value evidence gathered by photons and sonar with the steel left untouched. The legacy of the operation is defined by this successful enforcement. The marine engineers did not just locate a lost piece of heavy naval architecture, they established the absolute limits of forensic intervention in the deep ocean. They accepted that the ultimate physical truth of the internal explosion would remain permanently locked away beneath the massive, inverted hull. They accepted the strict boundary that honors the hundreds of men who remain entombed within the twisted steel. The demand for physical evidence was correctly subordinated to the absolute requirement of historical preservation. The site will never be razed, sectioned, or dismantled for public display. The massive armored plates and the delicate aviation structures will continue to slowly corrode in the deep, silent trenches. The absolute enforcement of the sovereign boundary ensures that the shattered warship will never be disturbed by industrial recovery tools, grappling hooks, or commercial lifting cables. Grounded strictly in both extreme marine geology and uncompromising international law, the wreckage remains exactly where it fell, a pristine and permanently locked historical vault.